There is a bridge that has become far more than concrete and steel. On paper, it is just 19 kilometers long, but in reality, it carries the weight of an entire military strategy, an occupied peninsula, and years of political symbolism. For Moscow, it was supposed to prove that Crimea could never be separated from Russia again. For Kyiv, it has become something very different, the most important logistical pressure point in southern Ukraine. And the question is no longer whether the bridge can't survive another strike. The real question is what happens when everything around it slowly stops working. Because modern wars are rarely won by destroying a single landmark. More often, they are won by making every road leading to that landmark increasingly difficult to use. To understand why this matters, we have to go back more than a decade. After Russia seized Crimea in 2014, geography immediately became a strategic problem. Ukraine still controlled the traditional land routes into the peninsula, leaving Russia dependent on sea transport and vulnerable supply lines. The answer was ambitious. Moscow invested billions of dollars to construct the Kerch Bridge across the narrow strait linking Russia's Taman Peninsula with Crimea. When the roadway opened in 2018 and railway traffic followed over the next 2 years, the project became more than infrastructure. It became one of Vladimir Putin's signature political achievements. The bridge symbolized permanence. It suggested that Crimea had been physically, economically, and strategically integrated into Russia for generations to come. But military planners tend to view symbols differently. A bridge that connects everything also concentrates everything. Every truck, every fuel shipment, every civilian vehicle, every military train, eventually depends on the same narrow corridor. That creates efficiency during peacetime, but during war it creates vulnerability. Since the full Minus-scale invasion began, Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated that even heavily protected infrastructure can be challenged. Previous attacks damaged sections of the bridge, disrupted rail traffic, and forced repeated repairs. Each incident reinforced an uncomfortable reality. While Russia could repair visible damage, the confidence that the crossing was untouchable became increasingly difficult to restore. By the summer of 2026, however, the picture had begun to change in a much more significant way. Rather than focusing exclusively on the bridge itself, Ukrainian operations increasingly appeared aimed at the larger transportation system supporting Crimea, instead of relying on a single dramatic strike. The strategy seemed to emphasize cumulative disruption. Railway connections, fuel distribution facilities, supporting bridges, electrical infrastructure, and transport corridors all became potential pressure points. The objective was no longer simply damaging one structure. It was reducing the flexibility of the entire logistics network that kept Crimea connected to the Russian mainland. One of the clearest examples came when Ukrainian special operations reportedly targeted a railway bridge crossing the North Crimean Canal near Rozhdel. Although much smaller than the Kerch Bridge, this crossing occupied an important position along the rail network linking eastern Crimea with the peninsula's central and western regions. According to Ukrainian officials, the bridge was struck. Repair efforts were subsequently targeted, and restoration became increasingly difficult. Independent verification remains limited because of the nature of the conflict, but the broader consequence became easier to observe than the strike itself. Railway services across Crimea began experiencing significant disruptions. Transport operators gradually announced the suspension of numerous passenger services inside the peninsula, rather than serving multiple destinations across Crimea. Remaining long-distance trains increasingly terminated in Kerch, forcing travelers to rely on buses or road transport for the rest of their journeys. For residents, the practical impact mattered far more than military terminology. A functioning transportation network had become slower, less predictable, and increasingly dependent on limited alternatives. Those alternatives quickly came under pressure as well. Reports described repeated temporary closures of traffic across the Kerch Bridge, sometimes lasting several hours. Even when the crossing reopened, accumulated delays spread throughout the wider transportation system. Trains arrived late. Bus schedules became unreliable. Travelers were forced to wait for replacement transport or arrange extensive private alternatives. Individually, each delay might appear manageable. Collectively, they began revealing the fragility of a network built around a small number of critical choke points. Fuel distribution presented another challenge. Crimea has long depended on steady deliveries from Russia, supported by both road and maritime transport. As disruptions accumulated across different transportation routes, local authorities introduced temporary restrictions on fuel sales in some areas, citing supply management measures, whether driven directly by military strikes, transportation bottlenecks, or precautionary rationing. The effect was similar. Public concern increased. Queues became longer. and everyday transportation became more complicated for both civilians and commercial operators. This is where logistics begins to tell a much larger story. Military campaigns are often imagined as tanks advancing across maps or missiles striking strategic targets. In reality, armies move only as fast as their supply systems allow. Every armored vehicle requires fuel. Every air defense battery requires replacement missiles. Every frontline position depends on ammunition, food, spare parts, and maintenance crews arriving on schedule. When transportation networks become less reliable, the consequences extend far beyond civilian inconvenience. Operational flexibility begins to shrink. That is why many defense analysts increasingly describe modern conflicts as competitions between logistic systems rather than simply between armies. Destroying an opposing force outright is rarely necessary if its ability to sustain operations can be steadily reduced. Every disrupted railway, every delayed fuel shipment, every damaged depot imposes costs that accumulate over time. None of these events individually determine the outcome of a campaign. Together, however, they gradually reshape what military planners consider possible. For Crimea, the importance of these transportation corridors extends beyond the peninsula itself. Since the beginning of the war, the region has served as a major logistical hub supporting Russian operations throughout southern Ukraine. Equipment, personnel, fuel, and ammunition have all moved through Crimea before continuing toward various sectors of the front. Any disruption inside that network, therefore, has implications reaching well beyond the peninsula's borders. And that larger strategic picture is what makes the situation around the Kerch Bridge increasingly significant, not simply as a structure, but as the center of an entire logistical ecosystem whose resilience is now being tested almost every day. The Prox 470-500 words documentary-style original structure based on publicly available information. The destruction of a command headquarters is dramatic. But from a military perspective, the building itself is not the real target. The real objective is the network inside it. Modern armies operate through command Midas and Midas control systems. Intelligence arrives from satellites, reconnaissance drones, electronic surveillance, and frontline units. Officers analyze that information, prioritize targets, coordinate logistics, and issue orders across multiple formations. Disrupt that process even briefly, and combat effectiveness can decline far beyond the immediate blast radius. According to publicly available reporting, Ukraine has increasingly focused on striking command posts, communications hubs, radar installations, and integrated air-minus defense assets rather than concentrating exclusively on frontline trenches. Military analysts often describe this as attacking the opponent's decision cycle instead of simply destroying manpower. If these assessments are accurate, the reported strike against the FSB-related facility fits into a much broader operational pattern. It is designed to reduce Russia's ability to coordinate operations, not simply to inflict casualties. At roughly the same time, open-source reports also suggested that a nearby Pantsir or -S1 air-minus defense system was destroyed. That detail deserves special attention. The Pantsir is designed specifically to defend high-value facilities against aircraft, cruise missiles, and increasingly, drones. In theory, systems like the Pantsir create overlapping defensive layers around command centers and critical infrastructure. But no air-minus defense network is perfect. Coverage depends on radar positioning, available interceptors, electronic warfare conditions, crew readiness, and the direction from which threats approach. Destroying even one battery can temporarily expose gaps that planners may attempt to exploit later. Military analysts sometimes refer to these openings as temporary windows of opportunity rather than permanent weaknesses. Ukraine appears to understand this principle well. Instead of relying on a single large strike package, publicly available evidence indicates Kyiv has increasingly favored repeated precision attacks against expensive defensive systems. The logic is straightforward. A drone costing tens of thousands of dollars can force the defender to expend interceptor missiles that may cost several times more. Even when the drone is successfully intercepted, the defender still pays a significant financial and logistical price. When the interception fails, the consequences become considerably greater. This economic imbalance has become one of the defining characteristics of the conflict. According to publicly available estimates, Russia continues spending enormous resources maintaining combat operations while simultaneously replacing damaged radar systems, missile launchers, logistics hubs, and command facilities. Ukraine, meanwhile, has invested heavily in expanding domestic drone production. Programs frequently mentioned in open-source reporting, including the long-range Beaver drone and the reported Black Box initiative, illustrate this broader trend. Analysts believe these systems are intended not merely to destroy individual targets, but to impose sustained costs on Russia's military infrastructure over time. Whether every reported damage estimate proves accurate is less important than the strategic direction. The battlefield is increasingly becoming a contest between relatively inexpensive autonomous systems and extremely expensive defensive infrastructure, and that changes the economics of warfare. Rather than matching Russia tank for tank or aircraft for aircraft, Ukraine appears focused on forcing Moscow to defend an expanding number of vulnerable locations simultaneously. That creates a difficult problem for any military, because every additional headquarters, logistics hub, refinery, ammunition depot, or airfield requiring protection also demands more radar coverage, more interceptors, and more personnel. No country possesses unlimited defensive resources, and as the list of potential targets grows, commanders inevitably face difficult choices about what can realistically be protected and what cannot. The consequences of that pressure are becoming increasingly visible, not because of a single catastrophic event, but because dozens of smaller disruptions are beginning to reinforce one another. Transportation networks rarely fail all at once. They slow down first, delays become routine, backup routes become overloaded, maintenance crews fall behind. Eventually, a system that technically still exists no longer performs the function it was designed to serve. That appears to be the broader challenge now facing Crimea's logistics network. Reports from the peninsula have described repeated interruptions affecting civilian transportation. Long queues have formed at crossing points leading toward the Kerch Bridge, while travelers have experienced delays, rerouted journeys, and extended waiting times. Satellite imagery published by independent media has shown significant vehicle congestion near the crossing, illustrating how heavily movement has become concentrated around a single remaining corridor. Whether these traffic buildups result from enhanced security procedures, temporary bridge closures, increased inspections, or simple demand exceeding available capacity, they all point toward the same underlying reality. When alternative routes disappear, every remaining route becomes more vulnerable. Energy infrastructure has also become an increasingly important part of this picture. Throughout modern warfare, fuel has often proven as decisive as ammunition. Armored vehicles, aircraft, generators, civilian transportation, emergency services, and industrial facilities all depend upon a continuous supply of fuel. Several reported strikes against oil storage facilities, electrical substations, and logistics hubs inside Crimea suggest that Ukraine is not simply attempting to interrupt transportation. It is applying pressure across multiple layers of the same logistical ecosystem. This reflects a broader evolution in military strategy. Earlier in the war, attacks on the Kerch Bridge attracted enormous international attention because they were dramatic, highly visible, and politically symbolic. Today, the emphasis appears far more systematic, rather than focusing exclusively on one iconic structure. Operations increasingly target the smaller components that allow the larger system to function. Railway junctions, fuel terminals, substations, repair facilities, and supply depots may receive far less media attention than a bridge explosion. Yet from a military perspective, they are often just as important. Military logistics has always followed a simple principle: redundancy creates resilience. If one road is blocked, another remains available. If one railway is damaged, cargo can be diverted elsewhere. If one fuel depot is destroyed, supplies can be drawn from another location. The challenge facing Crimea is that many of these alternatives have gradually narrowed. As more supporting infrastructure experiences disruption, flexibility decreases, the network becomes increasingly centralized around whatever remains operational, placing even greater pressure on those surviving routes. For Ukraine, this approach offers several advantages. Large-scale offensives require enormous resources and often produce uncertain outcomes. Logistics campaigns, by contrast, seek to impose continuous costs over time. Every repair project requires engineers, construction equipment, security personnel, and funding. Every damaged railway demands replacement materials. Every interrupted shipment forces military planners to redesign schedules and allocate additional resources. None of these individual burdens may appear decisive, but together they consume attention and capacity that could otherwise support operations elsewhere. There is also an important psychological dimension. Infrastructure serves not only practical purposes but symbolic ones. When people begin questioning whether trains will operate, whether fuel will remain available, or whether roads will stay open, confidence gradually erodes. For civilians, uncertainty becomes part of daily life. For military planners, uncertainty complicates operational planning. For political leaders, Uncertainty weakens narratives of stability and control. The Kerch Bridge illustrates this transformation perfectly. When it first opened, it represented permanence. Today, it increasingly represents dependence. Russia invested enormous financial, engineering, and political capital into creating a secure connection between Crimea and the mainland. Ironically, that success concentrated traffic into one of the most strategically important transportation corridors in the region. The bridge itself remains standing, but the network supporting it has become progressively more contested. This distinction is critical because wars are not always decided by destroying major landmarks. More often, they are shaped by reducing an opponent's freedom of movement. If military equipment arrives more slowly, if fuel deliveries become less predictable, if repair schedules become longer, and if commanders must constantly adjust logistics instead of planning future operations, strategic momentum gradually shifts. The objective is not necessarily immediate collapse. It is sustained pressure. Looking ahead, several indicators will reveal whether this campaign continues producing meaningful effects. The first is railway capacity. If suspended passenger and freight services remain limited for extended periods, it would suggest that restoration efforts continue facing significant obstacles. The second is fuel availability. Stable supply would indicate improving logistics, while continued restrictions would imply persistent distribution challenges. The third is traffic flow across the Kerch Bridge itself. Frequent closures, extended inspections, or recurring congestion may reveal increasing pressure on the peninsula's remaining transportation corridor. None of this means Crimea has become completely isolated. The bridge continues operating, supplies continue moving, and Russia retains substantial engineering capabilities to repair damaged infrastructure. It would be inaccurate to describe the peninsula as entirely cut off, but modern logistics is not measured in absolutes. It is measured in efficiency, reliability, and capacity. Each percentage of reduced throughput carries operational consequences that accumulate over weeks and months. Perhaps the most important lesson extends far beyond Crimea itself. Around the world, military planners are studying how relatively inexpensive precision weapons and unmanned systems can challenge infrastructure that once seemed almost impossible to disrupt. Massive bridges, rail hubs, fuel depots, and electrical networks remain valuable assets, but they also create concentrated vulnerabilities. Protecting every kilometer of supporting infrastructure is vastly more difficult than protecting a single landmark. In many ways, the Kerch Bridge has become a case study in 21st century warfare. The bridge still stands. Vehicles continue crossing it. Trains still operate, though with limitations. Yet the larger logistical system surrounding it is under constant pressure, rather than one dramatic moment that changes everything overnight. The situation reflects something more gradual and potentially more significant. It demonstrates how sustained attacks on interconnected infrastructure can slowly reshape an entire theater of operations without requiring a single decisive battlefield victory. That may ultimately become the defining story of Crimea in 2026. Not the destruction of one bridge, but the steady erosion of the network that gives the bridge its strategic value. Because in modern war, the strongest structure is only as resilient as the supply system surrounding it. And when every supporting link begins to weaken at the same time, even the most expensive bridge in Europe can become less a symbol of permanence than a reminder of how fragile logistics can be under sustained pressure.